The Persona series of video games has been around since 1996, but it has a fairly confusing history. What initially began as a spin-off title from the main Megami Tensei series now spans 2.5 decades, with releases on a plethora of different platforms. Newcomers to the series may find it particularly challenging to delve into as a result of its long history and interesting naming schemes. With 6 main series games and a whole host of spin-off titles, the series really is very interesting to look at. My name's John, join me as we explore the history of the Persona series. The first Persona video game was released in 1996, but our story actually begins almost a decade before this. In 1987, a company by the name of Atlus developed a game called Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei for the PC and Famicom, which is the NES in Japan. This is truly where the series begins, and this marks the start of the Megami Tensei, called Shin Megami Tensei internationally, series of games. Side note, a cursory Google Translate reveals that Megami Tensei translates to Goddess Reincarnation, with Shin meaning new, so New Goddess Reincarnation. Megami Tensei was, in turn, a video game adaptation of a trilogy of science fantasy books called Digital Devil Story, written by Aya Nishitani. You can probably already see that there are a lot of layers to this whole Persona / Shin Megami Tensei / Digital Devil Story situation. The first entry in the Megami Tensei series contained many gameplay elements that would persist through both that and the Persona entries to come later. It features high school students as the main characters, swords and guns as the main weapons, demons to fight or recruit, and a first-person dungeon crawling adventure. The Megami Tensei series had several more entries over the next decade. Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei 2 in 1990, Shin Megami Tensei 1 and 2 in 1992 and 1994 respectively, and Kyu-Yaku Megami Tensei in 1995. But it was 1994's Shin Megami Tensei If that was the closest to future Persona games, and that ultimately led to the whole series being created. While earlier Megami Tensei titles saw players traversing labyrinths or post-apocalyptic wastelands, Shin Megami Tensei If had players explore a much smaller scale environment in the form of a high school and 5 towers. The focus on a high school setting was well received by both critics and fans, and was the driving force in creating the Persona spin-off series. Now with that background out of the way, at last we arrive in the year 1996 with the very first game in the Persona series. Revelations Persona was released on the Sony PlayStation on September 20th, 1996 in Japan, and on December 14th in North America. A PlayStation Portable port was released in 2009, or 2010 in Europe, called Shin Megami Tensei Persona. For the sake of simplicity, I'll refer to this game in general as Persona 1. Persona 1 was directed by Koji Okada, was written by Tadashi Satomi, and the artwork and character designs were created by Kazuma Kaneko. Persona 1 focuses on a group of high school students at a high school called St. Hermelin High who play a game called the Persona game, which allows them to access their true inner selves, or their personas. Shortly after playing this game, the town of Mikage-cho becomes overrun by demons, and the group fights their way through the school and across the town to discover why. The story of the first game honestly reads like a fever dream at points, and it's absolutely worth watching a synopsis video on it. As mentioned before, the gameplay of Persona 1 is fairly similar to the early Megami Tensei games. Players take on the role of a mostly silent protagonist, but they can control the other students in the turn-based combat of the game. Dungeons are explored in a first-person view, and battle encounters are random. Various rooms, such as classrooms, are traversed in a rotatable isometric view, and this style would make a return in some of the games to follow. Combat occurs on small grid-based battlefields, and players are able to change the positioning of each party member in order to attack in different ways. Party members can attack by using their persona's magic skills, by melee attacking with a weapon like a sword, or by range attacking with a weapon like a gun. Players can also choose to attempt to converse with the enemies in an attempt to get free items, or even to get cards that allow the demon to join them as an ally. With these cards in their possession, players can head to the Velvet Room and talk to the long-nosed character of Igor in order to add new personas to their party. Both Igor and the Velvet Room are staples of the series and can be found in every game. Notable by its absence to any fans of later games in the series, Persona 3 and onwards, is the social links mechanic. This was only added in Persona 3, and is a large reason why some people recommend starting with that entry. There were some pretty large differences between the Japanese version of Persona 1 and the North American one. The North American release was aggressively localized. Think rice balls in Pokemon being referred to as jelly-filled donuts kind of aggressive. The team behind localizing the game thought that the game would be too Japanese for Western audiences, and either renamed or simply removed many of the Japanese references in the game. Several characters had their names changed, and one character even had his ethnicity changed. Finally, an entire route of the game, that makes up a large chunk of the playtime, was removed entirely. Fortunately, the 2009 PSP port of Persona 1 was far more faithful to the original Japanese version, and also added back in the cut Snow Queen route. Even though Persona 1 technically had two different names, one was for the original and one was for the later PSP port, so it ultimately made sense. However, Persona 2 gets a little bit more complicated. Persona 2 is actually split into two separate entries, 1999's Persona 2 Innocent Sin, and 2000's Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. We'll start off with Innocent Sin. Persona 2 Innocent Sin was released for the PlayStation in Japan on June 24, 1999. There was no Western release for the original PS1 version of this game. Confusingly, the sequel Eternal Punishment did get a worldwide release for the PS1 version. Luckily for fans though, a PlayStation Portable port of Innocent Sin was released in Japan on April 14, 2011, in North America on September 20, 2011, and in Europe on November 4, 2011. Of course, the PSP port had to have a slightly different name, so this was called Shin Megami Tensei Persona 2 Innocent Sin. Apparently, the original release wasn't localized for a Western audience due to time constraints, as well as some concern over how Westerners would react to some of the game's content. Now, what in the game could be so bad that not releasing it in the West would be the preferable choice, you may ask? It's Hitler. The answer is Hitler. A resurrected Adolf Hitler leads an army of Nazis in this game. Just like with Persona 1, it's very worth watching a video recapping this game's story. For Innocent Sin, Koji Okada transitioned to a producer role, while Tadashi Satomi and Kazuma Kaneko reprised their roles as writer and artist respectively. Once again, Innocent Sin tells the story of a group of high school students who attend Seven Sisters High School in Sumeru City. This time, an evil figure by the name of Joker is the group's target, as he's caused rumors to begin changing the world in strange ways. The story of the game is praised by fans, and is certainly worth delving into. Gameplay-wise, Innocent Sin is very similar to Persona 1, but with a couple of differences. Rooms are still traversed through a rotatable isometric view, but the biggest change is that this view now carries over into the dungeons as well, instead of them being presented in a first-person point of view. Combat is still turn-based, and characters can all be equipped with a persona for magic attacks, a weapon for melee attacks, and another weapon for ranged attacks. Another big difference in this game is the rumor system. Throughout the game, and by talking to different characters, players can hear rumors about all sorts of things, such as the kind of items a store might stock, or the appearance of a strong enemy in a nearby dungeon. Once the player hears a rumor, they can head to the local detective agency to have the rumor spread about. As a result of Joker's influence on the world, these rumors become true when spread and have a direct impact on the world around them. The PlayStation Portable port of Innocent Sin wasn't as drastically different as the Persona 1 port was. One notable change was to rename the character of Hitler to simply Führer, and to disguise him slightly by having him wear a pair of dark sunglasses. And there was also a new quest added to the game that made references to Shin Megami Tensei If. Persona 2 Eternal Punishment is a direct sequel to Innocent Sin, and takes place a few months after the end of the previous game. It's set in the same fictional town, and features several returning characters. In fact, Maya from the previous game is now the protagonist. In a completely flipped situation from Innocent Sin, Eternal Punishment's PS1 version received a Western release, but the later PSP port did not this time. Eternal Punishment was released in Japan on PlayStation on June 29, 2000, and was released in North America on December 22, 2000. The PSP version was released only in Japan on May 17, 2012. At the time of writing this video, a fan translation project has been in the works for several years, but is still not all that close to being released. It does, however, look extremely promising. All the key players of Innocent Sin reprised their roles in the development of the third game in the Persona series. Koji Okada as producer, Tadashi Satomi as lead writer, and Kazuma Kaneko as lead artist. The story of Eternal Punishment stars the character of Maya from the previous game. She's a journalist, and is assigned a story to write about Joker and a creepy rumor related to him. The rumor suggests that if someone were to call their own phone number, then Joker will kill someone for them. Obviously, as this is a direct sequel to the first half of Persona 2, it's hard to get very in-depth with this story without spoiling the previous entry, so I'm purposely keeping this one quite vague. As you might expect, gameplay is practically identical to that of Innocent Sin, even down to the rumor spreading mechanic making a return. Luckily, by this point in Persona's history, Atlus was no longer as gung-ho as they had been before about removing Japanese references in the localization process. As a result, Eternal Punishment received a very faithful localization for Western audiences. As for why this entry didn't receive the PSP port that previous games had, still not a whole lot is known. In 2013, Nick Maragos, an editor for Atlas, said in a blog post that unusual circumstances prevented them from localizing Eternal Punishment on PSP, and that's really all there is. So there you have it, the often overlooked trio, or quartet, or quintet depending on which ports you count, of games that make up the first 2 numbered entries in the Persona series. You followed along so far? The Persona series was very quiet for much of the early 2000s. A couple of Megami Tensei games were released, but between the end of 2000 and mid-2006, there were no Persona releases. This all changed when, on July 13th, 2006, Persona 3 was released on PlayStation 2 in Japan. The North American release wouldn't come out until a full year later, which was apparently due to production issues with the art book that would accompany the game. It was released in North America on August 14th, 2007, and in Europe on February 29th, 2008. Incredibly, a director's cut of Persona 3 called Fez was released in Japan on April 19th, 2007, almost 4 whole months before the regular version was released outside of Japan. Persona 3 is also when the naming convention began to get a little bit more confusing for newcomers. Having the first 3 entries in the series be numbered 1, 2, and also 2 wasn't the easiest to follow, but there were only a handful of games to keep track of at the time. Persona 3, however, had 3 different versions. There was regular Persona 3 on PS2, Persona 3 Fez, also on PS2, and Persona 3 Portable on PSP. To further complicate things, these games, and later ones as well, are often referred to just by their initials, such as P3F for Fez and P3P for Portable. To fans already familiar with the series, all the different names and abbreviations may make sense, but those new to the franchise had a bit of learning to do before they could begin playing. Directing and producing Persona 3 this time was Katsura Hashino, who'd previously worked on several Megami Tensei titles. Artist of the prior games, Kazuma Kaneko, this time handed off lead duties to Shigenori Sojima. Yuichiro Tanaka and Katsura Hashino handled the writing side of things. Persona 3 is set primarily in a high school called Gekokan High School in the city of Iwatodai. Players take on the role of a new transfer student who ultimately unlocks the powers of his persona and joins the specialized extracurricular Execution Squad. At night, the school turns into a massive tower dungeon called Tartarus as a result of the Dark Hour, which takes place every night. The protagonist also makes friends with other Persona users in the SEES. As one might expect, moving over from the PS1 to the PS2, the gameplay of Persona 3 saw huge improvements compared to the earlier games. Environments and dungeons were now modeled fully in 3D, and players could control the camera freely instead of being locked to 8 distinct viewpoints from the isometric layout. Combat is still turn-based, but it looks far more detailed than before, and features changing camera angles instead of being locked to one view for the duration of the fight. One notable change in the combat was that, with the exception of the PSP version, players could not directly control their AI teammates anymore. They're able to vaguely direct them using a tactics menu, but otherwise their decisions were made by the AI. This proved to be a fairly divisive decision among players, particularly with those who were used to the combat of the earlier games. When combat ends, there's the chance for a minigame called Shuffle Time to begin, which grants players the chance to get extra cash or experience, or even to be given new personas. Like in previous games, the protagonist is able to swap out their chosen persona by speaking to Igor in the Velvet Room. Perhaps the change that stands out the most in Persona 3 is the social links system in particular, and the simulation aspects in general. While the first 3 titles were essentially just JRPGs, Persona 3 combined that with what can really be boiled down to Japanese high school life simulator. Between the dungeon crawling segments, players are able to spend their free time in various different ways, such as improving skills by studying or reading, or spending time with friends to improve their relationships. Fans of later games in the series will be familiar with this system, but this was something very different at the time. Like with Eternal Punishment, the localization goal of Persona 3 was to leave as many of the Japanese references intact. This time, the team took it one step further by also leaving honorifics at the end of characters' names. One reason for being as faithful as possible was to see if the game would be a good way of introducing Japanese culture to a Western audience. Persona 3 Fez, side note, apparently Fez comes from festival, added a few updates to the original game, as well as an entire epilogue chapter called The Answer. The Fez version was released in 2007 and 2008 in Japan and North America respectively, and the PSP port was released in 2009 and 2010. Persona 3 Portable made some additions to the game, but also removed some parts, as might be expected in order to maintain its portability. Players now had the choice of playing as either a male or female character, and this changed some scenes in the social links area of the game. It also adds extra difficulty levels, but does not include the epilogue introduced in Fez. Portable also allowed players to control their teammates in battle. Lastly, interacting with the world was scaled back immensely, again to maintain the port's performance on the PSP. Just 2 years after the last entry, Persona 4 was released in Japan on PlayStation 2 on July 10, 2008, with a North American release following later that same year on December 9th. An enhanced edition called Persona 4 Golden was released on PlayStation Vita in 2012, with a PC port of the Vita version released in the summer of 2020. While Persona 3 had 3 different versions with both enhanced editions having pros and cons, Persona 4 Golden is absolutely the ultimate version of the game to play. Persona 4 was once again directed and produced by Katsura Hashino. Shigenori Sojima also returned as the lead artist, while Yuichiro Tanaka and Katsura Hashino were joined by Akira Kawasaki in the writing department. The protagonist of this game is once again a transfer student who moves to the small town of Inabara to attend Yasogami High School and live with his uncle and younger cousin. The main character soon makes new friends at school and learns about a game people have been playing called the Midnight Channel. To play this game, one has to simply look into a turned-off television at midnight when it's raining. When the protagonist tries it out, he's transported into the TV world. Meanwhile, there's an ongoing mysterious spree of murders plaguing the quiet town. Graphically and gameplay-wise, Persona 4 is very similar to 3, which is to be expected as they were released just 2 years apart and on the same platform. Environments, dungeons, and combat all look and feel very similar, although players now have the choice of either directly controlling their teammates or letting the AI handle it. Dungeons were also treated slightly differently. While Persona 3 featured the single sprawling dungeon that was Tartarus, Persona 4's dungeons are split into several smaller ones. The social links and improving skills features of course made their return as well. Persona 4 Golden was released in Japan on the Vita on June 14, 2012. Interestingly, it was originally planned to be another PSP release, just like Persona 3 Portable, which would have meant making significant changes to the gameplay to have it run well on the PSP's limited hardware. It was ultimately released on the more powerful Vita, which not only meant no cuts had to be made, but also meant that new content could be added. Some of the added content included a whole new character, new personas, and a vegetable garden the player could use to grow things in while at home. The spin-off titles of the series began in full force after the release of Persona 4, and we'll start getting into some of those now. Persona 4 Arena is a fighting game as well as the first spin-off title developed in the series. It was first released in Japan on arcades on March 1st, 2012, before also being released on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2012 in Japan and North America. It's notable for being the first title in the series that's not an RPG, as it is in fact part fighting game and part visual novel. Persona 4 Arena features characters from both Persona 3 and 4, although it doesn't include characters from any of the earlier titles, as I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear. The game was very well received and led to several more spin-offs, including a direct sequel called Persona 4 Arena Ultimax in 2013. Ultimax takes place 2 months after the events of the previous game, and features the same mixture of fighting game and visual novel gameplay. The next spin-off title was one for the Nintendo 3DS called Persona Q Shadow of the Labyrinth. It was released on June 5th, 2014 in Japan, and in November in North America and Europe. Like Arena before it, Persona Q also featured characters from both Persona 3 and 4. Again, still no 1 or 2 in any of these games. The gameplay this time was a throwback to the first-person dungeon crawling of Persona 1, as it was a mixture of the characters and story from Persona with the gameplay of Etrian Odyssey, another series that Atlus develops and publishes. The game was received well enough that a sequel was released. Persona Q2 New Cinema Labyrinth came out for Nintendo 3DS in Japan on November 29, 2018, and worldwide the following June. Since this title was released in 2018, it also features characters from Persona 5, as well as returning characters from 3 and 4. So far, the spin-off titles have all made a decent amount of sense. The Persona series began its life as a first-person dungeon crawler, so the Persona Q games were already quite similar to that. A fighting game may have been a tiny bit more different, but since there's combat in the main games, you can also say it made sense. The next spin-off, however, was very different and very niche. Introducing Persona 4 Dancing All Night. Dancing All Night is a rhythm game that was released for the PlayStation Vita in Japan on June 25th, 2015, with worldwide releases later that same year. In this game, players control characters from Persona 4 as they dance to music from the game. On top of the gameplay, Dancing All Night also features a story told over the course of the game. This might not come as a surprise, but I feel it's important to point it out, as a lot of rhythm games aren't typically known for their engaging stories. Persona 4 Dancing All Night was well received, and 2 additional games were released in 2018, Persona 3 Dancing in Moonlight and Persona 5 Dancing in Starlight, establishing a tradition of each main series game getting a rhythm game spin-off title. Personally, I'm still patiently waiting for Persona 2 Dancing in Daylight. Finally, a collection of all 3 dancing games was released on PlayStation 4 in 2018. After a string of spin-off games, the next main series entry, Persona 5, was released for both PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 in Japan on September 15, 2016, and worldwide on April 4, 2017. An enhanced version called Persona 5 Royal was released on PS4 in 2019 in Japan and 2020 worldwide. Including Royal, Persona 5 is the best-selling game in the entire Megami Tensei series. The game was again directed and produced by Katsura Hashino. Shigenori Sojima was joined by Masayoshi Soto in the art department, and Yuichiro Tanaka and Katsura Hashino were this time joined by Shinji Yamamoto as writers. In Persona 5, the protagonist moves to modern-day Tokyo to live with a family friend in the attic of a curry and coffee cafe. He attends Shujin Academy and makes several friends over the course of the game. He and his friends awaken to their personas while in the metaverse, and form a group called the Phantom Thieves, whose goal is to change the hearts of evildoers. Each of the Phantom Thieves has their own codename while in the metaverse, and the main character's codename is Joker. While Persona 3 and 4 were PS2 games, the improved technical aspects of the PS3, and to a lesser extent the PS4, meant that Persona 5 was quite a different game, in a similar vein to how 3 was very different to 2. Players are able to traverse several real parts of Tokyo, and are even able to navigate subway stations in order to take the train to different locations such as school. The social link system of prior games returns, although the relationships with other characters are now called confidants to match the burglary theme. Graphics were also drastically improved compared to the PS2 games, and its art style received extensive praise. Dungeons, called palaces in Persona 5, are navigated fairly similarly to how they were in 3 and 4, although they are no longer randomly generated as they had been in those 2 entries. Guns as ranged weapons also made their return after a break in the previous game. One big change, however, was the return of Persona 1 and 2's negotiation dialogue system. Players were once again able to talk to the various shadows they encountered in dungeons, and were even able to convince them to outright join their team as a new persona. Finally, there was the addition of Mementos, a huge multi-level dungeon that players could take their time proceeding through during the game, and that had various different effects depending on things like the day's weather. The enhanced edition of the game, Persona 5 Royal, was released in Japan on PS4 on October 31st, 2019, with a worldwide release coming the following March. By now, fans of the series knew what to expect with the re-released versions, and Royal was no different. It added several new features, most notable of which was an entirely new member of the Phantom Thieves. It also featured a new dungeon, a new area of the city, and brand new music. At last, we come to the final, at the time of writing, entry in the Persona series. Released in Japan on February 20th, 2020 and worldwide on February 23rd, 2021, Persona 5 Strikers was another first for the series. A spin-off sequel to Persona 5, only to the regular version though, no royal features are present in this game, Strikers was the first game to feature real-time hack-and-slash combat, as it was a crossover game with the Dynasty Warriors series. The original Japanese release came out on both PS4 and Nintendo Switch, and while the worldwide release came to both of those platforms, it also featured a PC release on Steam. The game takes place the summer after the events of the original Persona 5, and sees the protagonist returning to Tokyo for the summer holidays. After the group of friends is reunited, they discover that a shadow world similar to the one from before is available to them to enter. This time called a jail, these alternate versions of the world feature a monarch who's the evil counterpart to someone in the real world. Once again, it is up to the Phantom Thieves to change the hearts of evildoers. As mentioned before, Persona 5 Strikers features vastly different gameplay to previous games, as combat is done in real time instead of turn-based. Attacks are performed by pressing various buttons, and different combinations of button presses allow for different moves. Players are still able to equip multiple personas, although the roster is shrunk down considerably from Persona 5. Days are also far more structured in Strikers. Players aren't able to choose who to spend their time with or what to do in chunks of time, but they are able to complete side quests in order to become closer to their companions, and this is a requirement for leveling up skills through the Bond skill tree. In dungeons, players are able to control any of the 4 members in their immediate party they wish to, and so are actually allowed to roam around the dungeons as
insert audience favorite best girl here.
The game was well received, although it certainly was an interesting decision to release a spin-off sequel to a game on platforms that never actually received the prequel title. And there we have it, the entire history of the Persona series, stretching from, sort of, 1987 all the way to present day. Do you have a personal favorite title in the series? Have you played any of the games before Persona 3? Let me know in the comments. So this video was something very different for me, but I've been getting more and more into the Persona series recently, so I found myself becoming really interested in the timeline of the games, and this video project here was something that I really wanted to try out. I really hope people enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.